Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
Mark Acklom is a classic psychopath. Quick-witted, charming on the surface, telling extraordinary stories, brilliant at manipulating people, but equally without an ounce of any moral sense.
I'm journalist Helen Fosperoand.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
Welcome to the second episode of True Criminals, exploring the story of serial conman Mark Acklom. In the last episode, we heard in detail from his victim, Carolyn Woods, about how Acklom stole her heart and also £850,000 from her, ruining her life. Martin, you then got onto his trail.
Yes, we have a mutual friend, Carolyn and I, and she went to this mutual friend who put her in touch with me, and I don't get the chance to get stuck into many long-term investigations, but I was absolutely captivated by what had happened to Carolyn, the lack of sympathy and action by the police. And I didn't really take much persuading to help Carolyn, try to help her and find out what had happened to Mark Acklom, who I remembered as this schoolboy con man. But as I began to look into his more recent activities, I discovered that one of his trademarks was to use a number of aliases. So he wasn't just Mark Acklom, he was also Zach Moss, he was Mark Ross Rodriguez, he was George Kennedy, he was Mark Conway. That's how he introduced himself to Carolyn in 2012. That's why, although she remembered him as a schoolboy, the name didn't really mean anything. But he had this extraordinary ability to manipulate people. He just lied and swindled. And I soon discovered that it wasn't as though he was always getting away with it. He had been arrested and charged and spent time in prison, at least 5 prison sentences in Spain alone. But it had all started, his notoriety began in the 1990s, the infamous schoolboy fraudster. Mark Acklom, as he was then, a 16-year-old at a public school in Eastbourne College, posh school. He'd claimed to be a financial whiz kid, and although he was a very average pupil, he had excelled at business studies. And he'd even conned a teacher at the school to give him £15,000 to gamble on the stock market. It seems bizarre that a teacher would have that kind of confidence in this 16-year-old. And I remember talking as part of my research to that teacher. I tracked him down, and he was terribly embarrassed about the way that he had been duped. But he wasn't alone, because not only that, Acklom, as a 16-year-old, had gone to a building society and persuaded them to lend him £500,000, with which he bought a small mansion in South London, very close to an estate where the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, was living. He even conned his own family, ruined his father's business by stealing his father's gold Amex card and using it to hire private jets and swanning around Europe with his schoolboy pals and treating them to slap-up lunches in Paris and Geneva and other European capitals.
Where did your investigations take you?
Well, as I said, I felt enormous sympathy for Carolyn, and I really did want to help. So I travelled all over the UK and in Europe. At one stage, and this was a really good breakthrough for me and Carolyn, I discovered, in fact, Carolyn had already had some contact with a rather mysterious private investigator. Her cover name was Charlie's Angel. So she was somebody who was monitoring chat rooms on the internet, and she had stumbled across a number of victims who'd been conned by I don't even think Acklom was using his own name at any stage, but she managed to pull the threads together and realise that there was this conman who'd found a number of victims and had extorted lots and lots of money. And bit by bit, we managed to establish that this was the schoolboy conman from the inner London Crown Court. At the age of 18, he was put on trial for those crimes that he committed as a 16-year-old 2 years earlier. He ended up admitting 124 charges of theft and deception. Now, he had a very fierce judge in front of him who seemed to have no sympathy for this schoolboy. You could argue quite rightly so. But his lawyer, his defence lawyer, argued, and I think we can believe that this perhaps was a genuine argument, that the young Mark Acklom needed psychiatric help, but the judge wasn't interested in that. He branded this 18-year-old as a wicked conman. He described him as being utterly selfish and completely ruthless, and he jailed him for 4 years, and that was an extraordinarily punitive sentence. He had ruined his parents' lives, apart from all the other victims. His father's business had to close down. His mother, I remember interviewing her, and she said that they were absolutely devastated, and she felt that she had had to call in the police when they discovered what he'd done by using her husband's gold Amex card. They had to sell their house, his parents, and move into rented accommodation, simply to raise money to pay off their wayward son's debts.
And then he vanished from the public eye for quite a number of years, didn't he?
Yes, well, as I began to pick up the trail, I couldn't believe that there was no other record of him being chased and charged with any crimes around Europe. So there was this big gap in my research until 2012, when he turned up in the West Country. And as Carolyn has explained, he was trying to ingratiate himself with movers and shakers in that area, trying to get his tentacles into businesses. And I met a brigadier who was a leading figure in the Prince's Trust, Prince Charles' charitable, one of his charitable arms that dealt with trying to help young people. And this brigadier, another very, very bright, erudite guy, said that Acklom had contacted him and had put forward a proposal to raise £8 million for the Prince's Trust. And the brigadier told me that on paper, it all sounded incredibly pucker. And he said he became very, very close to accepting Acklom's offer, but something made him hold back. And some of the things that Acklom was telling him, he became slightly suspicious about. And because he was running this very pucker organisation, or part of it, for Prince Charles as he was then, he rode back, and he told me that subsequently, having discovered everything about Mark Acklom, and I was able to tell him what I'd found, he was mightily relieved that he'd never taken up Acklom's offer to raise money, because he said almost assuredly Acklom wouldn't have raised the money and would have found a way of making money for himself and perhaps robbing some of the funds from the Prince's Trust.
And then he disappeared again after fleecing Carolyn out of hundreds of thousands of pounds. How did you finally track him down?
Well, Carolyn was able to offer some information about what she thought Acklom had got up to after leaving her and fleeing the UK. We knew, or she knew, that he'd set up an office in Alicante in Spain. And I went there and I spoke to somebody who had worked with him. And this was a woman who herself had been rather conned by being hired by Acklom and hadn't been paid wages. But she told a story about how the police suddenly turned up one day at this office in Alicante asking questions about Acklom. And then he suddenly did a midnight flit with his family and went to San Remo in Italy. So I followed the trail there and was having real trouble establishing what had happened next. But I had a very good contact in the Spanish police, a woman detective I'd done a story with about fugitives a few years earlier. And bless her, she was able to help me, whether she was doing it officially or unofficially, I don't know. But she went into the records and she was able to tell me that Acklom had been arrested in San Remo because of a crime he'd committed in Spain and been extradited back to Spain and was being held in a police cell in Cartagena under a different name. He was now known as Mark Ross Rodriguez. And eventually we established that in 2014 he'd been convicted of a fraud, and essentially he'd defrauded two Spanish brothers of nearly £250,000. He'd got out of them a deposit that was paid to him because he convinced them that he was able to sell them some riverside flats in Fulham. And of course, these were flats that he didn't own. His Spanish lawyer I eventually spoke to thought that, even his own lawyer thought that Acklom was a psychopath who could sell you smoke. That's what he told me.
And you finally came face to face with Mark Acklom in jail.
Yes, well, I covered a one-day trial in Cartagena, and he was given I think it was a 3-year sentence and sent to prison in Murcia. And I went to see him. Again, this is all rather bizarre. I managed to contact him. I wrote to him, and he wrote back. He sent me a visitor's order, so he was quite keen to meet me, and how could I resist that? So I went to prison to see him. I almost got there too late because I'd forgotten my passport. And I had this short window of opportunity to go and visit him. And I knew that if I missed it, I wouldn't be allowed back. So I scrambled there at the last minute, retrieved my passport, was allowed in, met him for the first time. I'd seen him in court, but this was the first meeting with him. And we sat either side of a perspex screen. And I struggled to ask him the questions that I wanted to because he just would not stop talking. And at one stage, he showed me a scar on his leg. Behind the screen, he lifted up his leg and pulled up his trouser and said, look, this is part of my life. And he said, look at this scar. This is what the IRA inflicted on me when they were torturing me. And of course, by the time I kind of peered through this rather hazy screen, he'd put his leg down and I didn't really see what he thought he was or what he was pretending to show me. He denied defrauding Carolyn. He claimed that he was the victim of various business ventures that had collapsed when partners and investors had pulled out when they discovered his past. Over the next 7 months, while he was in prison, he wrote me a number of letters, 10 letters in all, and their tone swung between his angry denials and contrition and promises to go straight.
And what sort of things did he write in those letters?
The tone of all of these letters was that he'd done nothing wrong. Everything was somebody else's fault. I mean, that was the basic tone of it. He'd set up business, he'd attracted investors and backers and so forth. And as soon as people discovered his teenage past, they pulled out of it. He claimed that he'd been wasted by the domino effect of what had happened since his conviction in 1991. And there was another extraordinary episode where, during that time in prison, he asked me, and he sounded very serious, he said, do you think Sky would pay for my bail? And he wanted €30,000. And quite seriously, he said, look, would Sky stand up my bail money? You'll get it back, I absolutely promise. I should say that we didn't put up his bail money. He signed off one of the letters with a big hug. And I got the sense that we were actually becoming quite good pals. And I suppose, in a sense, I was beginning to get drawn in by him. But I took a deep breath, stood back, and realised what was happening. But it did give me an understanding about how other people could be sucked into his rather extraordinary world. He was then freed from jail. He was told that he couldn't leave the country. But of course, he did leave the country because it's very easy to get across European borders.
Of course he left the country, and now British police are finally starting to take some proper interest in Carolyn's case, and they were starting to pursue him too, weren't they?
Finally, Avon and Somerset police were on his trail, but only, I think, because with Carolyn's help and with the help of the rather mysterious Charlie's Angel, the internet sleuth, we had discovered where he was. And I told the police in Bristol, I said, look, I found him. He's in prison in Spain. And they didn't believe me, but they did their checks and they discovered that I was right. And I thought, well, they're going to get a European arrest warrant for him. Of course they should, because of the charges or the allegations that were made by Carolyn and others. But by the time they got the European arrest warrant, he'd fled. He'd been released early from prison, persuaded the authorities to release him on bail, and had disappeared again. I pursued him. Eventually, we discovered that he was in Switzerland. Somebody sent Charlie's Angel a snatched photograph of him sitting at a pavement cafe in Geneva. And that was a huge breakthrough. We followed the trail. I discovered that he was living outside Zurich. He was now calling himself Mark Long, and he'd set up an extraordinary company that, on the face of it, sounded absolutely pucker, part of his MO. It was called Swiss Discs, and it was a company that was seeking investors for a business that was selling black box data recorders for driverless cars. And it sounded like a legitimate organisation. And he was telling potential investors that Elon Musk was behind it and had invested 5 billion Swiss francs into his company. Now, extraordinary as it sounds, he was finding people to send him money as investors in this bogus company. I met a lovely, gentle guy who had been a banker in Switzerland, a German chap, who'd become a corporate investor. And he told me that he sent Acklom 400,000 euros to put into this company, Swiss Discs. And I said, well, that's extraordinary that you should invest so much money. But I said, when you met him, weren't you suspicious at all about what he was telling you? And he said, I never met him. I just spoke to him on the telephone. He convinced me of this business opportunity, and I sent him the money. And I said, well, how do you feel now? And he said, pretty stupid. But that was an intelligent, erudite banker who you would have thought knew all about investors and dodgy investments and so forth. Even he had been conned.
Well, before we bring Carolyn back into the conversation, she's patiently listening to all those things that happened when you were off hunting for him. He was finally tried for fraud again in Britain. What happened there?
Yes, well, we managed to persuade the police where he was, and eventually they were able to establish that he was in prison this time. I mean, he'd been arrested in Switzerland for old crimes, again, that the Swiss felt that they had to deal with first. Now, none of that came to anything. So the British authorities moved to extradite him, and they managed to do that. I managed to get on the plane in which the Avon and Somerset detectives brought him back. At one stage, I got my cameraman to try and take some video of him, and that set all hell loose on the plane. We almost got thrown off the other end, but we got our images. He was put on trial, and then at the last minute, he pleaded guilty. He'd been charged with 20 fraud charges against Carolyn. He admitted 5 of them, which meant that the other 15 or so charges were just effectively dropped. That meant that he was given a reduced sentence of 5 years and 8 months. And again, typical of Acklom, he managed to get released early, was sent back to Spain, where he was still wanted for another outstanding crime. He went to prison in Spain and was again released from that sentence and may have gone on the run again, but he's essentially a free man, we think, living in Spain with his Spanish wife, and may already have become a Spanish citizen.
Carolyn, it's extraordinary to hear Martin's side of the story there and listen to the other people he conned. How did you feel just now with him reliving all that? And how much at the time did Martin's help mean to you?
Oh, well, Martin's help really meant everything to me, because it was only because of that I think the police finally took some action. And yes, hearing all that again, I mean, he is quite an extraordinary person. I mean, a few things came to mind there. One was Martin was talking about the German banker that he interviewed when he was in Switzerland, who'd invested a lot of money in this Swiss Discs company. And I hope things have changed, but I'm not sure that they have changed all that much. But it was really then when, thankfully, that particular person went public and gave Martin an interview. But it was when a man who had been a businessman spoke out and said he'd been conned, that a lot of people that I knew, but also the police, I think suddenly thought, oh, well, this clever man's being conned. Maybe there's something in this, you know? So it was a bit galling, really. At the time also, there was a lot of victim blaming. And I think hopefully people are much more willing to talk about having been defrauded in this manner now. I think they are. So if there's one thing that this whole case has done, if it's helped people to actually talk about it, because I think Martin will agree that you went to see a lot of people, didn't you, Martin, who just didn't really want to say anything about their involvement with Mark Acklom. And I know the police also couldn't get people to talk. And he was involved with very respectable people. He had this knack of interweaving his total fantasy lies with real things that were going on, with real businesses. He got very heavily involved in a public school in the West Country, actually took charge of all their fundraising. He got to know judges, he got to know businessmen, and these were real people. You could look them up and there they were. So he's very, very clever at all that. And I remember with that Swiss discs thing, because I remember Martin and Charlie's Angel sending me a video. And actually, I recognized so many images from that video of that sham company that he'd used on a company that he'd set up here, he'd used on that website. So I knew instantly. I think there was another company as well, Martin, wasn't there, which I wasn't quite so sure about, a pharmaceutical venture or something. But no, that Swiss disc thing, there was absolutely no doubt. He's just got, I don't know, he can just lie. He's very, very convincing. I don't know how he does it, but at the time, I used to think, well, has he got some sort of power like Derren Brown that he can just get into your brain and you will believe whatever he says and do whatever he asks you to do? He's certainly got some sort of strange hold over people.
Yes, you're absolutely right that many victims of fraud just feel that they've been naive at best, perhaps at worst been really, really stupid, and are very, very reluctant to admit how they were taken in. And I do remember you telling me in the early days how police were so dismissive of you. And I think at one stage, when you began to talk to the detectives, you almost felt like you were under suspicion yourself.
Oh, right at the beginning, yes. I remember one interview in particular with 2 police officers and a financial advisor. And yes, they seemed to be under the impression that I had bought property in Spain, in the Canary Islands. The financial advisor to the police stated wrongly that I had a certain Spanish word on my bank statements. I didn't. I'd never heard the word before. But yes, I felt very much under attack during that interview.
Prosecutors, Carolyn, believe that Mark Acklom stole more than 1.3 million from others throughout his whole criminal career. 12 years on, Carolyn, have you received any money back at all? And if not, do you still hold out some hope that you might be able to recover some of those funds you lent him?
I haven't received a penny back. You live in hope that you might retrieve something somehow one day. But I think actually Martin told me that at one of these hearings, that the Proceeds of Crime Act hearings, I think the judge more or less said, I don't even know why we're devoting any more time to this. She's never going to see a penny of her money, especially from someone who's living in a different jurisdiction. So it's looking very unlikely.
In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com.
Carolyn, I suppose I should ask you, because listeners are going to struggle, I think, even now to understand your story. When people say you were foolish or naive, what's your response to that?
I'm not generally a foolish person or a naive person, or maybe I'm a little bit naive. It depends how you define naive. I had got through over 50 years of my life basically trusting people, being good to people, expecting them to behave in a good manner towards me, and they always had. And I think if you're not in the least bit devious, or you've never come across that sort of behaviour before, it's almost impossible to imagine that anyone could be so utterly evil and lie so easily, absolutely with impunity. So I would say maybe I was a bit gullible. I was certainly a lot happier in those days, because now I find trusting people very, very difficult. And it's a pretty miserable way to live, to be honest. Always wondering if someone's telling you the truth, or just being suspicious of people generally. It's made me wary. I don't really like that. But I don't think I'm a stupid person. I have said I am romantic. And I think in this meeting Mark Acklom at the time when I did, and if you have to put it into context, I'd actually been very happily single for 9 years post-divorce. But I was setting up a new life. I was in a new place. So I didn't feel vulnerable, because I actually felt full of confidence. Actually thought I'm making a real success of this new phase of my life. But I suppose I didn't have good friends around me. I was making new friends. That also meant that I was accepting invitations, feeling I should really make the effort to put myself out there, meet people, all these sort of things. So although I didn't feel vulnerable, I felt empowered. I think because of my circumstances, I probably was quite vulnerable, although it wasn't at the time a word I ever would have used to describe myself. And I think also I'm romantic, and he was very refreshing at the time, because he wasn't someone I wasn't going to be expected to wash his socks. He didn't tell me until later on about ailments. You know, I had a date with someone, and all he did for an hour was tell me about all his ailments. So having this exciting, very energetic man come into my life, and he was quite entertaining, and he made me laugh. He was quite funny, all those sorts of things. Yes, I did. I fell for it, unfortunately.
I hope you didn't have a second date with the ailments guy.
No.
No. Carolyn, I don't think anybody would blame you, having heard your story, for being wary now. I think you're very, very unlucky, and your lovely nature, which I'm sure is still very much there, was preyed upon. Martin, you've chased Acklom around Europe, followed his trail of destruction, his prison time. What do you think he gets out of it? Caroline talked about him enjoying some of the lies that he watched her swallow. Do you have any insight or explanation about his behaviour?
One of the reasons that I was so keen to pursue him was for me to try to understand why he behaved the way he did. And I did speak to police officers elsewhere who had pursued these types of fraudsters, but also spoke to psychologists. And what most of them seem to agree on, that Mark Acklom is a classic psychopath. Quick-witted, charming on the surface, telling extraordinary, but to some people believable stories. Brilliant, I suppose, at manipulating people, but equally without an ounce of any moral sense. I spoke to one psychologist who talked about his dark triad signs of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And it does seem to be nature, not nurture, that's caused this. I'm not an expert. I tried to get the expert's view. Mark Acklom came from a perfectly loving and respectable background, middle-class family in South London. I managed to interview his mother very early on, and she told me that she felt that he'd been affected mentally by a difficult birth. She said that forceps had been involved, suction and so forth. She felt that there is some evidence, and his sister, who's a GP, also told me the same story. There is some evidence to suggest that that kind of difficult birth can cause mental health issues and pressure on the brain during the birth. And they said that that could explain some of those psychopathic tendencies that they recognised in Mark Acklom. He starts offending again, as soon as he's caught and jailed, he goes back to what he's always done. And the police officer who was finally responsible for getting him back and putting him on trial said there's no doubt in his mind that as soon as he is free, he'll go back to lying and swindling because it's such a central part of his character. Even in his letters to me over the years, even where he said he was contrite and he wanted to make up for all the wrong that he'd done, I know that all of that was hogwash, and I've seen him go back to committing more crimes.
Carolyn was treated pretty poorly by the police when she first reported the scam back in 2012. If one positive thing has come from this case and your exposure of it in your reporting, Martin, is it that police are perhaps taking fraud more seriously now and doing a bit more than telling victims to fill in an online form?
They absolutely are. When Carolyn told me the initial police reaction, go away, fill in the online form, and that's how we will deal with it. Eventually somebody, a detective, will talk to you. And even when she said, look, it's not a minor fraud, it's £850,000, it's nearly £1 million, they still would not treat her seriously enough to get a detective to talk to her and get the basic details. And I'm convinced that Carolyn's story and her very poor treatment, lack of sympathy by the police, was instrumental in changing the whole way that police forces now deal with victims of fraud. One detective described fraud as a crime that doesn't bang, bleed or shout, so it's not attractive to detectives in the same way that murders and kidnap and rape and, all those perhaps more obvious crimes are. And bear in mind that all of us, if we become a victim of crime, are most likely to be the victim of a fraud in some way. Carolyn's case and others prompted an inquiry by a former Deputy Met Commissioner at Scotland Yard, Sir Craig Mackey, to look into the way that police dealt with fraud. And he discovered that fraudsters generally were being allowed to operate with impunity. That's how he described it, because police forces were reluctant to deal with it, partly because they weren't equipped to deal with fraud. They've learned their lessons, and in 2021, chief constables were ordered to give fraud a greater priority. Now, you'll have to talk to more recent fraud victims to find out whether that is their experience, but certainly victims like Carolyn now aren't simply sent away and told to fill in an online form.
Well, let's hope not. Caroline, it does strike me that con artists are often glamorized in popular culture. Hollywood movies like Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, Catch Me If You Can, they're portrayed as fast-talking, wisecracking, lovable rogues. And we rarely see stories about the real human impact of fraud. And that's something you've spoken about in your book, Sleeping with a Psychopath. Was that a bit of a cathartic experience for you, putting what happened to you down on paper?
Funnily enough, I've been asked that question many times, and it wasn't really cathartic. I started writing things down. Well, actually, immediately I realised what had happened. Even before I realised what had happened, I did make some notes about some strange events in my relationship with Mark Acklom. And I started writing things down even more once I realised who he was and what had happened, just so that I had the freshest memory of everything for the police. I wrote an awful lot down. And I did also think, and you're quite right when you say characters like Mark Acklom are glamorized. Actually, you could make a very glamorous film about just what happened with him and all his activity over a year in the Bath and Bristol area. It was full of big houses, planes, fast cars, public schools, mansions, all these sort of things. And he presented himself as a glamorous character, and he's very good. He's a bit chameleon-like. He can change his appearance. He can make himself look like the multimillionaire, and he can act the multimillionaire. But I'm diverting a little bit here. In court, I had to turn around. I made myself to make sure it really was him behind the screen. And it was. And I got such a shock because it was this very uninteresting man sitting there in a hoodie and jeans. And I just couldn't understand it. And I said to the police inspector, did he have to come to court wearing a hoodie and jeans? Did no one give him some decent clothes? And he said, no, that's what he chose to come in. And then I got it. I thought, that jury is going to look at him and think, well, how could she ever have thought that this person scribbling on a piece of paper, looking very ordinary, was a multimillionaire? So, yes, these characters are glamorized, but they do destroy people's lives. They are so cruel and they leave just devastation everywhere in their wake. And I'm sure if more people had spoken out, we would have realised that down in Bath and Bristol. He just left people. It wasn't just me that he was conning, but because nobody else really would speak about it, nobody really heard about all the other things that he did. They are really horrible, destructive people. I think of Mark Acklom as evil. I don't know, Martin is saying that he thinks it's his nature. I think it's his nature as well. And it's very, very awful when you've been manipulated by such a character.
Carolyn, we know that you're still suffering from the fallout from Acklom's crimes against you for various reasons. And we also understand that it must be very difficult to talk after all these years about what he did to you. But thank you very much again for sharing what are clearly some very painful thoughts, but we really appreciate your time and hope that at some stage, and I know you say it's unlikely, that perhaps you will get some financial recompense from what he did to you.
Thank you, Martin.
Oh, thank you. I echo that too, Carolyn. Thank you so much for being with us today, and don't lose that lovely, kind spirit that's clearly there.
Thank you very much. No, I will try not to, because then he really would have won. If nothing else, I don't want the evil people to win. We want to keep being nice. And I hope that I might just become a little bit more trusting again. I think that's the worst thing for me. He has really knocked my faith in people quite a bit. It's quite a dent there, but hopefully he'll come back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I felt really sad, Martin, listening to Carolyn's story. Somebody is obviously a lovely, kind woman and beating herself up a bit about the fact that she trusted somebody who turns out to be an international con man and now clearly struggling perhaps financially. Where does the story go from here?
I'm sure it's not over. Carolyn has tried to and continues to try to get some of her money back. In very simple terms, she lost £850,000 and she's not had a penny back. And there are two things going on. One, as she described, the Proceeds of Crime Act. So this is essentially a series of court hearings in which the police are trying to establish how much Mark Acklom made from his crimes against her and from other people. But I've sat through some of those hearings and it's quite clear to me that whatever they establish in terms of what he's made from his crimes, the chances of Carolyn ever getting any of that back or the police getting it back from Acklom are minuscule because he's not in the UK. How they could possibly enforce any kind of monetary order against Acklom is impossible to see. So she's got no real hope of going down that avenue. Something that she tried a couple of years ago, and I reported on this, was to try and hold Barclays Bank to account and tried to get some compensation from the bank, because what happened during the police investigation was that a Barclays Bank employee and a former employee were arrested as suspected accomplices of Acklom's. And how that came about was that, and Carolyn explained this to a degree, Acklom persuaded her to open an account at Barclays, and he used that she was paying him money from that account. He didn't get it directly. He managed to persuade her to pay it to an accomplice, a former Barclays Bank employee who had an account at Barclays. But there was some evidence the police uncovered to show that some of that money was paid through the account of a woman who was still working for Barclays. So that woman and the man were both arrested as suspected accomplices, and they were never charged. They were investigated, questioned, but in the end were not charged with anything. But Carolyn firmly believed that Barclays should, because of that aspect of those Barclays accounts being used against her, that the bank owed her something. I reported the story. She wrote to Barclays, explained what had happened, explained what she knew of what had gone on in the police investigation. And Barclays wrote back, asked her for more details, spent about 6 months investigating it, and in the end said, "We don't owe you anything. Nothing was proved by the police, so we're not going to pay you a penny." And I spoke to a lawyer who deals with this kind of claim, and he said, well, as the law stood in 2015 when this was happening, when she was a victim, yes, there was no compunction. Barclays were not obliged by law to pay her anything. But it left open the question of moral obligation. And I think there's a very strong argument that because of what happened, because of some evidence that a Barclays employee and former employee were involved in transferring the money that she was paying under coercive control to Acklom, then Barclays should have paid her something.
You said the police have changed the way that they look into fraud now. Is it different in the banking system? If this happened today, might Barclays be under obligation to pay some form of compensation?
Yes, the law has changed. Carolyn's argument was that because such vast sums were being transferred from her account to these other accounts, and as she's explained, the first payment was £26,000 and £850,000 she transferred in a matter of weeks. You'd have thought that somebody at the bank at Barclays would have alerted her. They did bring it up, but in a very cursory manner. Now, the law on coercive control was introduced around 2015, and since then, the banks have a greater duty of care to customers around that whole area of coercive control. And the bank today would have made greater efforts, should make greater efforts to contact somebody like Carolyn Woods, whose account was effectively being emptied. And a bank now would alert a potential victim, in their eyes, like Carolyn Woods, and do much more to ensure that these were legitimate transfers.
Whenever we do stories like this, Martin, with a cracking guest, they always start the conversation privately before we record with, "I'm only doing this because of Martin." Over the last 4 decades, you've built up a lot of trust and have some extraordinary contacts, but you take things very personally too. Carolyn's story really means a lot to you, doesn't it? Because off you went in search of Acklom all over Europe. Do you get in some ways drained by how involved you get with some of these stories like Carolyn's?
I didn't spend a continuous amount of time chasing Acklom. I had to do it bit by bit. I have a day job in which I have to cover stuff that happens on a daily basis. And to be honest, I'd pursued Acklom for the best part of 2 years before I actually broadcast a story on Sky News, because I had to kind of fit all the pieces together. But from day one, it was a compelling story. There were 2 things. Carolyn had come to me for help. Okay, so I felt duty-bound to help her. But it was also this sense that she'd been let down so badly by the police, who dismissed her as a silly woman and treated her as a suspect at one point in her eyes. We haven't got time to go into the detail now, but if you sit through the transcripts of some of the police interviews, it's extraordinary the way that she was dealt with a complete lack of any real sympathy. But of course also, it was an astonishing story. So all of those things, I think, propelled me into spending more time on this story than most others I've covered.
Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram @true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.